Welcome, everybody. If we could take your seats so that we can get started. Finish conversations later, maybe? There's a reception after to finish conversations. But, okay, I'll just go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. I'm Lynn Ransom. I'm the curator of programs at the Schoenberg Institute for Manuscript Studies. And I just advanced the slide somehow. I'm not touching it. Is this good? Okay. All right. So like I said, I'm Lynn Ransom. I'm the curator of programs at the Schoenberg Institute for Manuscript Studies, and I welcome everyone to the penultimate session of the Truth Conference. It's my pleasure to introduce the next two speakers. I'm sure we'll continue these considerations of truth in new and exciting ways. I'll start with the first speaker. Zoë Opačić is the associate professor in the history and theory of architecture at Birkbeck College, University of London, and a fellow, excuse me, of the Society of Antiquaries of London and a council member of the British Archaeological Association. She specializes in medieval art, architecture, and urbanism in Central Europe, with a particular focus on the development of late medieval cities. And she'll be addressing that theme today in her talk, Seeing and Believing, Visualizing the Late Medieval and Early Modern City. Please welcome Dr. Opačić.
Many thanks, Lynn. And by way of testing the microphone, I also am going to use this to extend my gratitude to Verkholantsev for organizing not just the event, but on this really timely, relevant, important, multifaceted topic, as we've been able to see today, to the Wolf Humanities Center for really immaculate organization, and to Nick Herman for this really exquisite exhibition that you must see. You've heard about it just a moment ago, so really it's seeing is believing in this case, so do go and see it. And now to my paper. The concept of truth, simultaneously absolute and elusive, is often said to lie at the heart of artistic endeavor. Beauty is truth, truth beauty. These immortal lines of John Keats' 1819 poem Ode to a Nightingale have alluring simplicity that belies the complexity of his poetic meditation on art, time, and nature. But this quest for truth, or in painterly terms, the appearance of truth, has a long tradition in visual arts. Already in the 15th century, the humanist historian Bartolomeo Fazio included Jan van Eyck among the most praiseworthy men, viris illustribus, on account of the lifelike nature of his painting. In an unexpected affinity with Keats, Fazio declared that painting is indeed nothing but a wordless poem. There is hardly, writes Fazio of painting, one of the other handicrafts that needs greater discretion, seeing that it requires the representation not only of the face or countenance and the lineaments of the whole body, but also far more of its interior feelings, that the picture may seem to be alive and sentient and somehow have action. Fazio dwells in minute detail on Van Eyck's paintings, which he saw or knew about, but are no longer known to us, included a painted mirror, though not this famous mirror, in which you see whatever is represented as in a real mirror. But among many figural paintings, he also singles out a circular representation of the world. This lost orb, or a globe, which Van Eyck painted for Philip of Burgundy, was, according to Fazio, so extraordinary that, in quotation, no work has ever been done more perfectly in our time. You may distinguish it in it, not only places that lie, and the lie of the continents, but also by measurement, the distances between places. Here, as elsewhere, Van Eyck conceived, as Panofsky observed, not a mere representation, but a reconstruction of the visible and measurable world. Moreover, the artist's reconstruction of individual physiognomy or environmental topography is not only an exercise in verisimilitude. As Leda Seidel argued, It is also testament to the artist's standing witness to the objects and events he depicted. And in this case, famously, of course, Van Eyck does that in presence, in person, and also in his signature. The Renaissance and the 15th century more broadly are identified as the period when the image is seen as a testament of truth rather than a display of pictorial invention. Contemporary terms such as ad vivum, neer het leven in Dutch, or contrafactor, on which more later, are all used to indicate that in Joanna Woodall and Thomas Balfour's pragmatic definition, an image is a faithful likeness or a bearer of reliable data. This could equally apply to a portrait, an image of a city, a landscape, a depiction of a plant or an animal, as well as an engraving or a cast. In each case, the concept of ad vivum contains a porousness between different cognitive elements. The replication of the appearance of a specific subject, the transmission of reliable, useful information about a subject, and the evocation of a living presence, and all these categories are already there in Faccio. Another important factor is the persuasive effect of the image on the beholder as being a source of a knowledge about the subject, a city, a person, or say a rhinoceros, whose authority is based on artistic skill and on the status of the artist as a mediator of that knowledge. My aim today is to examine how these parameters of truthful representation were negotiated in late medieval and early modern views of cities in the North. I will first briefly outline some key strategies used to navigate the path between the visible and the invisible, or higher truths. The first is that of cosmic world perceived not as an optically palpable entity of Van Eyck's creation, but in an abstract form of a diagram. The image of God as the great artificer in the process of creating the world remained largely unchanged over 250 years between two examples before you. Unlike the Parisian and other medieval illuminators before him, the Nuremberg doctor Hartmann Schedel chose the structured form of a circle to represent the totality of the world at the moment of its inception. Diagrams offered a singular kind of mapping. In Jeffrey Hamburger's conjured definition, they plot rationality in spatial terms and map out cognitive as well as mechanical processes and procedures. Although they are visually descriptive by nature, city views and maps also create a cognitive and mechanical guide through complex spatial systems. Views of medieval cities, whether as self-standing works or integrated into devotional paintings, arguably more than any other genre, a manifestation of a spatial turn in late medieval art. That approach is best illustrated in late medieval itinerary maps, of which this is probably the most famous example. They open new horizons of knowable world, suggest imaginary routes for journeys of the mind, and manipulate space. For Matthew Paris and his readers, whether actual or virtual travelers, the route and the destination mattered far more than the sights along the way. Cities selected according to daily itineraries or journeys are represented in a pictorial shorthand, and Rome, the holiest place in Western Christendom, appears on folio 4 rectum, which you see here, as a marginal pop-up. So you can just see it here with River Tiber and the 4 principal basilicas. The next categories are cities as proxies or surrogates, and this is something slightly different to what Nick was explaining yesterday as fake views, which I like very much, actually. So in these city views, optical manipulation occurs not only because of the limits of artistic mediation, so the artist simply didn't know what a place looks like, but in order to declare intrinsic truths of a higher value than those conveyed by the means of visual mimesis. So the depictions of Constantinople in the Bohemian manuscript of Sir John Mandeville's Travels of circa 1400 offer two unlikely views of this eastern city. On folio 9 verso, which is on your left, Constantinople is seen as a Gothic city enclosed by a towered wall and identified by a large gilded statue of Emperor Justinian in the foreground. The figure, standing protectively over the city gates, has dropped his orb, an eloquent metaphor for the loss of power of Byzantine rulers. The center of the city consists of a large square with a century-planned Gothic structure in the middle, presumably denoting the Cathedral of San Sofia. Unfamiliar with the true appearance of Constantinople, the illuminator followed the conventional iconographical shorthand and depicted the Byzantine metropolis as a modern Western structure. However, a closer scrutiny of folio 11 recto on your right shows a subtle game at play. Here we are presented with the same view of the city, only without the statue. Instead, an emperor seated in the square is being shown a set of the Passion relics for which the Byzantine treasury was famous. The Mandeville text offers no description of this scene, and it is clear that the illuminator or his patron has offered his own visual gloss. The dignified bearded figure of the emperor, wearing a distinctive German imperial crown, is the Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV Luxembourg, a tireless collection of the Passion relics. The unusual architectural setting has all recognizable traits of the new town, Charles IV's new district of Prague, founded in 1348. And I won't kind of run you through it, but it really is. The illuminations of the Mandeville travels thus articulated a contemporary view that, from the Bohemian perspective at least, the axis of the Christian empire had shifted from Rome and Constantinople to Prague. Nearly 100 years later, after the Mandeville illuminations, Hartmann Scheldel presents us with these two views of Constantinople in his printed historical compendium, the Liber Chronicarum. The first, spread over folios 129 and 130, shows the city as a mixture of real and imagined buildings, with some of its famous monuments, San Sofia, looking here like a twin of the Florence Duomo, the Church of the Holy Apostles, and the Royal Palace, huddled and enlarged, distorting their real topographical relationship. It is striking that Constantinople before our eyes is a holy Christian city with crosses and Byzantine eagles on its walls. Nearly half a century after the Ottoman conquest, there is no visible presence in this view of the city's new masters. In contrast to these composite views based on several older prints, Schedel's second view of Constantinople records a storm, here seen on the left, records a storm of July 1490, witnessed and described at length by Venetian merchants, which destroyed many buildings, including Justinian's column, and killed, it is said, 3,000 inhabitants. Despite liberal shifts in perspective, this view records with some accuracy not the historical city of Constantinople, but Istanbul of Schedel's day, populated with Ottoman buildings, including the minarets flanking Santa Sofia. Though not an eyewitness of the calamity that befell the city, Scheidel takes on a role as a storyteller and a chronicler of events whose credibility depends on the truthfulness of his visual record. This new European reality is vividly captured from the opposite perspective on the 1683 Ottoman siege map of Vienna, imagined entirely through the prism of Islamic architecture. So these are the Ottoman, back, let's go back, one more. So these are the kind of camps around the walls of Vienna. Vienna, of course, was not conquered. This is St. Stephen's with the huge minaret instead of its original Gothic tower. This is the Hofburg, and so on. Scheidel's World Chronicle, composed as an urban almanac, was produced at a turning point in the depiction of cities. Published in 1493 in Nuremberg, first in Latin and then in German, it contains over 2,000 engravings by Wilhelm Pleidenwurf and Michael Wohlgemuth. Of those, 116 bear place names, but only 30 are based on first-hand observations, and indeed give us a first glimpse of some of those European cities. Scheidel's chronicle became an instant blockbuster, with over 1,000 copies still in existence. And in fact, you can see two just next door. Within very short time after its publication, geographical knowledge of Earth expanded to include an entire continent, which caused, let's just move on, which caused a break with how the habitable Earth was viewed and represented. Cartographers could only respond adequately because they had theories and techniques at their disposal to master new challenges, including the changing concept of space. It was no longer deemed sufficient to visualize and describe, although traditional panoramas like those by Schedel continued to thrive. But now they also had to measure and index an urbanized world of increasing complexity. It is perhaps not surprising that the wealthy, emancipated, free imperial city of Nuremberg and its writers, printers, and artists, including Dürer, led the way. From the mid-15th century, alongside a well-developed tradition of patriotic Meistersinger, a new breed of classically educated humanists such as Enea Silva Piccolomini, the future Pope Pius II, Conrad Keltis, immortalized Nuremberg in prose and verse and accorded it a central place within a broader historical and geographical concept of Germania. This genre of writing found its visual counterpart in the growing number of city views and maps emanating from Nuremberg or produced by its draftsmen and printmakers, and which declared the city to be a geographic as well as creative totius Europae umbilico, the navel of all Europe. Nuremberg seemed to have been surveyed in 1456, but in 1540, Hans Bayer produced the first wooden model of the Bavarian city and the oldest surviving in the German-speaking world. Bayer received 35 guilders on account, as the commission documents state, of the depiction of Nuremberg set on a board with all the houses, alleys, and others, and then a further 5 guilders with a proviso that he would not make any more of the same. Nevertheless, the many details of Bayer's model show that the purpose of its making was not only to capture the city's new defensive strategy, hence don't make any more, or to create a topographical record. The blue, red, green color distinction given to the river Pegnitz, around which the city grew, and to the roofs of individual churches, chapels, and other public institutions and spaces, show an element of local pride and a desire to highlight the city's principal landmarks. Bayer's map in relief. I'm stuck for some reason. Yes, I'm trying. Oh. Back to life. Okay, so Bayer's map in relief encapsulates the growing interest in accurate topographical representation of the late medieval and early modern world. From urban skylines punctuated by landmarks whose precise spatial relationships remain vague, and to the all-seeing bird's-eye views, representations of cities advance with optical and mathematical tools such as perspective and surveying, as is evident on the De Barbary view of Venice, which is in fact printed by Anton Kolb in Nuremberg, and Jörg Zeld's view of Augsburg. This nascent cartography was helped by the humanist-driven revival of interest in Greco-Roman topographical and geographical texts. Ptolemy's Cosmographia was first translated from the Greek into Latin in the early 15th century and was available in print from 1475, and it provided a detailed introduction to descriptive geography, including introductions on how to draw maps. Now, my final example in this highly selective, it has to be said, overview will demonstrate that not all 16th century city views follow the path to scientific mapping. Here we are. The 16th century view of Rostock in the shape of a scroll is an important outlier in this discourse and occupies a category all of its own. Produced between 24th of June, 1578 and 24th of June, 1586, The almost 90-meter-long view of the Baltic city of Rostock is one of the most unique views of any city. Well documented and recently restored, the Rostock Scroll, better known under the name of its maker, Vicky Scholer, is a meticulous celebration of an ordered urban life in a prosperous Hanseatic city. Its attention to detail has led a number of German scholars to use the scroll as a visual testimony to a diverse range of historical discourses, from civic and religious architecture, infrastructure, water supply and shipbuilding, to the role of women, markets, local economy, and university rituals. The Rostock Scroll's uniqueness lies in its unusual format and the fact that its creation is not only precisely fixed in time, but also firmly attributed to the hand of one person. We know little about Scholer. It is assumed that Vicky, which is short of Friedrich, came from a family of moderate means and that alongside his brother trained as a merchant journeyman. Thought to have been born in around 1560 into a family of merchants, Vicky would have been only 18 at the start of this project, which took the best part of a decade to complete. It could be, therefore, seen as a youthful pursuit of a grocer's apprentice who may have aspired to a higher recognition among his fellow citizens. Rostock in is Scholer's microcosm, the center of his universe, an inexhaustible source of interest and pride. At the time when Hanse merchants traveled the world, Scholer seems never to have gone far. His scroll and his written chronicle, which he wrote until his death in 1625, are an encomium of the everyday and the familiar, imbued with the notion of the common good already articulated in the urban rhetoric of Italian city-states. The handmade quality of the scroll, together with Scholer's authority as an inhabitant and a first-hand witness, gives his visual document another layer of veracity. The scroll is bookended by the inscriptions, which you see translated here, which mark the inception and the conclusion of his project, forming a perfect chronological arc of 8 years between the 2 feast days of St. John the Baptist, perhaps a personally significant day for Vicky. Scholars of the Northern Renaissance have observed that the common practice of inserting artist signatures, so Dürer's iconic AD, for example, into their work was not only a method of authentication, but also a form of a contract between the artist and the viewer. The main inscription, quoted here in German, which runs across the length of the scroll, declares that this is true representation of the highly praised and widely renowned Old Port and Hanseatic city of Rostock, capital of the state of Mecklenburg. The credibility of Scholer's work as a true, or in German, wahrhaftige, image of Rostock is not based on objectivity of science and its verifiable methods, but on Scholer's personal lived experience. The term abkontrafaktor doesn't really roll off the tongue, loosely translated as a representation, is an unusual form of the Latin contrafactum, which is used as early as the 13th century by Viardoncourt, here on the left, to denote a figure of a lion as contrefaire à vif. The term becomes prevalent in the 16th century precisely at the time, as Peter Parshall observed, when, quote, the arts of sculpture and painting were gravitating away from the empirical verifiable in favor of establishing their own order of truth. The German term abkontrafaktor adds another layer of meaning to the relationship between the real object and its depiction. Joshua Mahler's lexicon, Die Deutsche Sprache of 1561, and to illustrate it here, I put up a copy from Magdalen College in Oxford, translate Abkontrafechung, so Abkontrafechung, into Latin as effigies or efficio. So Scholer's term presents us thus with an effigy of Rostock rather than a simple image, a picture, or in German, Bild. The scroll remained tightly wound until the most recent 2011-2020 restoration project, which reversed many previous and problematic interventions and provided a more in-depth understanding of Schole's magnum opus and its subsequent history. And these are a couple of images I took in Rostock Archive. The scroll is actually lying flat on the table, but I upended the image so you get a more sense of how it works and what it looks like now. And this is another. So during this campaign, the Stadtarchiv Rostock made the radical decision to separate the scroll into 7 individual segments, which can be stored flat, but also joined up for continuous display. The decision to separate the scroll 5 centuries after it was created, though reversible and beneficial to its long-term preservation, altered a fundamental aspect of Schole's composition. Schole's mapping of Rostock, which combines a more traditional bird's-eye view of open spaces with a continuous street-level view of buildings, which is what you see here, demands of the viewer to shift perspective and to reorientate while mentally and physically pacing along the lengthy scroll. This kinetic experience of viewing puts the scroll in a very different pictorial category from that of static urban vedutas of its day. With its extreme length and unusual hand-drawn composition, Schole's view of Rostock belongs to a rare genre of manuscripts, but one with an extensive and global lineage. Scrolls have a long tradition in European and non-European cultures, and I've put here more or less random selection, this Bari exalted roll, mortuary scroll, a genealogical roll. This is from Chorworth, but we'll hear much more from a real expert in a moment. And actually, almost the most similar example comes from a long way away. This is one of the most famous Chinese medieval paintings. It's much longer, as you can see. I've only given you here a fragment because, and already it looks like a sort of tiny pencil. There are many similarities. I mean, it's painted in ink on silk. It's viewed from left to right, obviously. The depiction of the city is also a little bit problematic, and what it shows, it has lots of text that also serves partly to authenticate it and also combines sort of meditation on the subject. But it's really, it would create a very interesting parallel in another paper. So scrolls, generally speaking, were associated with religious and non-religious texts. They presented an alternative to a foliate and bound codex. While the format of some of these objects was dictated by practical considerations, such as the ease of transport and storage, as well as particular forms of use and display, Schole's choice is less obvious for a city view and seems to anticipate painted and photographic panoramas of the 19th and 20th century. Trying to kick it into action again. It's gone to sleep. Okay, needs nudging a little bit. So while it would be anachronistic to ascribe the cinematic quality to Schole's work and his limited artistic skills, his visual approach has something in common with that of a single camera take. The artist wanted the viewer to experience the city immersively, village by village and house by house, and to understand inner relationships of its individual buildings and parts, which was not possible in a conventional long-distance view. So I'm saying this and I'm showing this, which is, of course, it would be anachronistic to describe a cinematic quality to his work and his limited artistic skill. But his visual approach does have something in common with a single camera take, and this is another view of it. So it's this kind of immersive view, following it building by building and street by street. Moreover, despite its extensive walking through the city, the view is selective, excluding less salubrious parts, and it's constructed around its principal highlights. Scholle creates his unique topographical itinerary by seamlessly switching directions and viewpoints, as demonstrated on this transposition of his itinerary on a later print by Václav Holler. His limited understanding and interest in the perspective has often been remarked on. But the diagonal two-point rendering of Rostock churches, the university buildings, and the Rathaus, which you see here, has a startling pop-up effect in contrast to the flatness of the rest. The composite view of many of his buildings ensured that their best features were on display regardless of the conflicting points of view. Contrary to the laws of nature, entire structures, wings or facades positioned on the either side of the building, so behind, were on the view placed side by side. Schole's pedantic, detailed drawings are not simply an exercise in architectural cataloguing. Small incidental details give the view a temporal dimension and root his work in everyday human activity. Smoke billows out of many chimneys, while swashbuckling student processions and weddings traverse its squares. Of the markets, the Neumarkt, or the New Square, roughly in the middle of Schole's view and the epicenter of the city, teems with people and animals on a busy market day. Among horse-drawn carts, pigs, drying stockfish, pots, pans, haberdashery, and clogs for sale, we see the rat catcher, just here, with a live rat on his head and more dead rodents hanging off a pole, who causes fascination among the children. All this activity takes place below a city pillory, which you see just here, and just note that detail there, where, shockingly, a woman is seen being flogged. Now, we can only speculate what Vickers Schole's intention was in including this startling scene in the most prominent part of the scroll. It may have been to offer a memorable visual anecdote of the market life at its fullest and most colorful. His more serious moralizing purpose may have been to demonstrate the importance of justice in a peaceful and prosperous city. Finally, it can also be interpreted as a validation of Schole's role as a mediator of Rostock's true appearance and faithful likeness. Although artistically not comparable to Van Eyck's hyper-real treatment of his subjects we started with, Schole's Imago Contrafacta bears witness to events which have taken place in the urban theatre of 16th century in Rostock and convinces us that we must do the same. As scholars of the Arnolfini portrait have pointed out, Van Eyck's signature declares that he was here, fuit hic, whereas we, the viewers, are here now to guarantee the enduring validity of the image. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Our next speaker is Professor Emily Steiner. Professor Steiner is the A.M. Rosenthal Professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania. She's the author of several monographs, most recently John Trevise's Information Age, Knowledge in the Pursuit of Literature, circa 1400, and numerous other edited collections and articles. And today she turns her attention to a recent project involving a roll manuscript housed nearby at the Free Library of Philadelphia. In her talk entitled History on a Roll, Lies in Politics and the Medieval Genealogical Roll Chronicle.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. So I'm going to be talking about genealogical roll chronicles and explain why they were so popular as a vehicle for historical writing at a particular moment in time in 15th century England. And I'm also going to try to explain how they were designed to convey certain historical truths. First, I want to just briefly acknowledge the team of scholars who have been working on transcribing, translating, annotating, and digitizing genealogical rolls in Philadelphia libraries. And I want to give a special shout out to Amy Hutchins, who first got me hooked on rolls. So what you see in front of you is a standard issue, very familiar form of Western medieval history writing. history as a codex. This one's in Latin. It's from about the year 1200. It's handwritten on parchment. It has double columns and reader's notes in the margin. It contains two canonical 12th century authors and historians, William of Malmesbury and Geoffrey of Monmouth. And so my guiding question is, how do rolls do history differently than codices? And it's true that the medieval codex, just to go back to that, the medieval codex does anticipate modern historiography to the extent that it even kind of disguises the way that medieval historiography departs from modern historiography, whereas rolls are very strange, and we expect them to have strange ideas about historical truth. But medieval history writers of all stripes, sorry, I'm having trouble with it.
If you click on this.
Okay. Medieval historical writers of all stripes were concerned with historical truths in a way that resonates with modern historiography. And I tend to put these historical truths into two kinds of buckets. The first bucket is extrinsic historical truths that are contingent, contextual, and relational. In the other bucket are historical truths that are intrinsic truths, that are inherent, essential, and self-evident. So for example, of an extrinsic historical truth, a medieval historian would subscribe to the idea that true historical accounts can be compiled from trustworthy authorities. And they might be biblical, or they might be Roman historians like Livy, or early church fathers like Augustine, or monastic historians like Bede. Another extrinsic historical truth that medieval writers would subscribe to is the idea that true historical accounts can be established by rationalizing divergent or conflicting accounts. So for example, one source might not mention King Arthur at all, another might say he's fictional, and a third might say that he was real and important. Another example of an extrinsic historical truth is the idea that some historiographical practices yield truer accounts than others. So for example, if eyewitnessed by an ancient local, or documented by monks, or sung by minstrels, or accompanied by miracle. But medieval writers are also very unapologetically invested in intrinsic truths that are inherent or essential or self-evident. So for example, the inherent nobility or antiquity of a whole people. So this is why medieval writers invented a Trojan lineage for ancient Britons to show that a whole people was old, had been around a long time, were chivalrous, had classical affiliations. Another intrinsic historical truth is the essential holiness of a person or a place or a dynasty, or the naturalness or self-evidence of a claim to possess or a claim to rule. So in the rest of this paper, I'm going to be thinking about how do rolls do history differently? How do they convey historical truths? And also, how do rolls, by their very nature, by their physical design, by the material conditions in which they are rolled and unrolled, mediate between extrinsic and intrinsic truths? So my case study is mid-15th century England, where there was a huge surge, even in industry, in producing histories on rolls. Many hundreds of these fascinating objects survive, including several fabulous ones at the Penn Library and libraries in the area. There's always new ones that are turning up at auctions. They're very unstudied. And the ones that I'm talking about are English royal genealogies, genealogical chronicles in roll form, the ancestors of Ancestry.com. There are also what we call universal chronicles. So they illustrate a long succession of kings and queens, beginning at the top of the roll with the beginning of time, with Adam and Eve or Noah, and ending at the bottom of the roll with whomever the reigning monarch of England is, almost always Henry VI or Edward IV. And I'm going to get back to these two troublemakers in a moment. These 15th century genealogical rolls are constructed of long membranes. Okay, thank you. The membranes of these rolls they're constructed of these long membranes of parchment attached together at the top of the bottom. The whole roll can be of wildly different lengths, from 2 feet to 50 feet. They're extremely visually striking and easily recognizable, with a centered genealogical line. And other historical materials like parallel genealogies and diagrams and tiny maps and blocks of explanatory text come on either side of that center line. The membranes of these rolls literally stitch together different periods and sources of history, combining what we consider to be more factual and more legendary ones together. And so the kind of staple histories that you find in genealogical rolls from this period are Adam and Eve, Noah, and biblical genealogy, followed by legendary British genealogy from Brutus the Trojan to King Arthur, followed by the 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, followed by William the Conqueror and Anglo-Norman descent, going to the Plantagenets, the Lancastrians, and the Yorkists, and ending with Henry VI of Lancaster or Edward IV of York. These rolls also have other things that might get kind of woven into the roll and kind of running down the sides. They might have Northern Germanic tribes. They often have a succession of Roman kings and emperors. They often have legendary genealogy of the Romans, of the Normans woven in. They often give the Frankish royal lineage and the French monarchy, sometimes the Spanish royalty who married into the English line, often genealogies of Welsh princes, and sometimes prominent English aristocratic lines like those of the Mortimers, the Nevilles, the Beauforts, the de Clares, and probably belong to one of those families. Sometimes, though, they have very, very odd materials that are incorporated in that must have come from a kind of manuscript that was on hand. And one example in the Free Library roll that we've been studying, if you, on the very side of the roll, you can see that there's these long sort of blue boxes. And these relate the history of the Dukes of Aquitaine, just a few stories from the Duke of Aquitaine. And there's actually only like one possible source that I know of that these could have come from. You can see in the big yellow boxes is like the center history, which is the history of English kings around the time of the Norman conquest. In the green, you have a genealogy of Welsh princes. They're kind of pretty easy to locate. In the blue, in the first set of blue boxes, you have French kings, also easy to pin down. But the stuff that comes from the Dukes of Aquitaine is really odd. So one is a legend about Duke Cenebrinus, a crusader of some kind, who was favored by the Virgin Mary, and his Muslim bride, Fenice, who he converts to Christianity. And this seems to come out of some random romance. Another story in those blue boxes on the right-hand side is about Saint Valeria and her cousin, the Duke of Aquitaine, Stephen. When she wouldn't marry, there she is. Stephen wanted to marry her. She said no. He had her head cut off. St. Martial very graciously restored the head. Stephen was so surprised by this that his whole group converted to Christianity. So this was a real surprise to find on the roll. And we can see how the genealogical roll is actually able to present different kinds of truth side by side. It can chart the hereditary descent of a line of kings or political succession, but it can also chart as genealogy the intrinsic holiness, piety, and antiquity of a noble line. So why were roll chronicles so popular in this period and place? So the genealogical roll chronicles from 15th century England are usually described and dismissed as political propaganda by modern scholars. Calling them propaganda is not wrong. I don't think medieval authors would really recognize that term, but these rolls were produced between the late 1420s and the early 1470s, and they take sides, these rolls, in the bloody civil war known as the War of the Roses. This was a prolonged period of political upheaval in which the Yorkist and Lancastrian factions competed for the English throne, and the throne actually alternated several times between these two factions. And the genealogical rolls that are produced in this period, though universal in scope, are designed to promote the claim of either the Lancastrian king, Henry VI, or the Yorkist contender, Edward IV, usually with textual and visual support for the legitimacy of one over the other. And so I think it's worth taking just a minute to understand the claims. So Henry IV and Edward IV were rival claimants to the English throne who presented competing hereditary claims to political succession. Both of them are great-grandsons of Edward III and Philippa, who had too many sons and daughters that it became a problem. Henry VI's Lancastrian descent is from Edward III's third son, John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster. Edward IV's Yorkist descent is from Edward III's fourth son, Edmund, Duke of York, and also from his second son, Lionel, Duke of Clarence, through the female line. Problems started back in 1399, when Henry Bolingbroke, son of the Duke of Lancaster, later Henry IV, deposed and had murdered the reigning monarch Richard II, his first cousin, who was childless. Although Henry IV was succeeded by his son and grandson, Henry V and Henry VI, he left the door wide open for rival claimants. So during the War of the Roses, hundreds of these genealogical rolls were produced in England to support either the Yorkist or Lancastrian claim. Some of these seem to be ready-made, almost identical copies, like these three, which were probably produced at the beginning of Henry VI's reign, when he was a very vulnerable 9-month-old. Others are extremely luxurious, bespoke, unique, like this roll from the Society of Antiquaries, which was dedicated to the Lancastrians in 1455, and were meant to shore up Henry VI's claim to the throne after defeated by the Yorkists at the Battle of St. Albans. So what can rolls do for political propaganda that codices can't? Well, the roll form connects the reigning monarch, Henry IV or Henry VI, whose claims might seem to be disputable, relational, contingent, relying on an extrinsic truth, to a much longer history that's antique, that's illustrious, that's sacred, whose truths appear to be intrinsic, inherent, and essential. In theory, any genealogical history could make those connections, but the roll form does it especially well. And I just want to take 1 minute for you to see what it looks like to unroll and re-roll a scroll. No. So this is the 1066 roll that's in our collection here at Penn. You want to skip to the second part? Do you want to skip to the second part? Okay. This is the end of the roll. So one of the things that you can see, we can turn that off now. You get the idea of it. So one of the things that you can see is that you can't flip through a roll. Rolls are extremely unwieldy, extremely cumbersome. You have to yield to its mechanism. You have to sort of go on the roll with the roll. The physical roll, the rolling and unrolling of it, brings together the extrinsic and intrinsic truths of the roll. Its vertical shape and the continual lineal movement of the material object manually link the present to a long, illustrious, and sacred past. And it's through the physical roll that genealogical history realizes its full potential. The roll also has a special ability to finesse historical ruptures. First of all, it's multimedial. What can't be dealt with visually through genealogical lines can be dealt with textually with text blocks. Secondly, the role as a material object, which has to be manipulated in peculiar ways, further minimizes gaps in time and transition between sources. As you roll out the role, the gaps and the transitions recede into one long continuous line. And the role's shape and its movement subordinates these gaps and transitions to a larger lineal trajectory, from Adam and Eve to Henry VI or Edward IV. And finally, the role chronicle, with its strong vertical central line, makes recent contemporary political succession, which was in reality volatile and contested, look inevitable and natural. All roads seem to be leading inexorably to Henry VI or Edward IV. The role makes political succession, so-and-so followed so-and-so, look like and feel like biological descent. It makes it look like so-and-so begat so-and-so. And one of the reasons why the Lancastrian and the Yorkists decided to choose the role was probably because there was a much more prestigious antecedent, a much more uncontroversial model of doing history, which is the historical compendium of the genealogy of Christ. This was written by Peter of Poitiers around the 12th century, predating the Wars of the Roses by 250 years. And though this text was copied into codices, it was originally designed to be a roll, and it continued to be produced as a roll for several centuries. In fact, Peter's biographer, Alberic, tells us that Master Peter was looking out for his poor students, so he devised family trees sketched on skins that displayed the histories of the Old Testament. And it became increasingly important in the later Middle Ages that Jesus and Mary and Joseph descended from the illustrious lineage of King David, despite the fact that Jesus' father is technically God. So Peter of Poitiers' role depicts the biblical royal lineage of Jesus, and in doing so associates the role form with sacred history. But Peter also shows how genealogy might offer different kinds of historical truths at the same time on the same line. So in the case of Peter of Poitiers, you have the family trees of Herod and the family trees of the three Marys, but you also have a lineage of succession of Roman emperors, Augustus Caesar and Tiberius Caesar. And then you also have on the same line events that succeed each other: the nativity, the childhood, and the passion of Christ. The final reason why rolls make good propaganda is the membranes. You can stitch them together end to end. You can roll these big boys backwards or forward on a table. You can unstitch them and hang them side by side on the wall. And as I said, these membranes give you the sense of unrolling history to its inevitable conclusion. History inexorably leads to whomever is at the bottom of the roll. But the material form that supports the claim of whomever is the end of the roll also threatens dangerously to undermine that claim. Because if you think about it, as a scribe, you can always add another membrane. So these rolls could, in theory, be infinitely extended, kind of rolled out forever. And this is a super convenient thing for those people who follow fortune's favor, who roll with the times, who play for both teams, who stay current, who stay alive. So interestingly, and this is true with many of these rolls, some of them were designed to support and to show the legitimacy of Henry VI, the Lancastrian, but someone has added another membrane and then showed us how it could be continued now to Edward IV. So now Edward IV is at the end of this roll. In this very crazy looking Canterbury roll, it originated again with Henry V and VI, and then someone else used the blank space in the membrane to draw these angry red lines showing how actually Edward IV is at the bottom of the roll. So if you can repurpose a roll for your own propagandistic purposes, how can you prevent later scribes from repurposing and adding on to yours? How can you bring history on a roll to a decisive end? And some 15th century roll makers, and this is my final point, but some 15th century roll makers went to tremendous lengths to make sure that history stopped with them, that no one else could add on to it. And no roll maker was more anxious than the one that made the Free Library of Philadelphia Lewis roll, who goes out of his way to make sure no one else adds any history to the roll and convey a different historical truth. So the first thing, and the most savviest thing he did, was before there was Noah, before there was Adam and Eve, there was Edward IV. So Edward IV is there on the top of wearing all of his heraldic regalia, the trapper on the horse. And then you have a big illuminated quote from John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was the God, and Word was with God. So even if the rest of the membranes of this manuscript disappeared, we would still have the first one with Edward I at the beginning. The same roll maker on the same roll added this crazy medallion at the end, which takes up a huge amount of space, and assures us that that Edward IV was the most credible reigning monarch, that both the popular opinion and his hereditary right made him the most worthy king of England. That person, though, left a little bit of space at the end of the main membrane, which was a little bit dangerous. This could have been continued, but a Westminster clerk, Kano, inscribed in a different script, St. Bridget's prophecy, supporting Edward IV's claim that the younger son must yield to the older son, et cetera, et cetera. So someone very cannily went in there and tried to make sure that no one else could continue the role. The roll maker went even further. So right smack in the middle of the roll, when we're just about to talk about the Anglo-Saxon kings and Alfred the Great, the roll maker says, hey, wait a minute, just remember, where are we now? We are 31 kings from the most illustrious king, our Lord Edward IV, the true and undisputed king in the direct line from Adam to Noah and Noah to our day, lest we forget who this roll is really about. And then at the very end, he gives a kind of trigger warning, a kind of warning label that if you're not careful, you can get fooled by rolls because they're full of usurpers making false claims. In fact, rolls turn out not to be a collection of rightful claimants, but a rogues gallery of usurpers. So he says, watch out for Charles, watch out for the Valois dynasty, because they're a bunch of usurpers. And from this time on, anyone who reigns in France are usurpers. Or look out about the kingdom of Spain, where King Peter was murdered by his bastard brother Henry, who's a usurper. And from this time forward, all who have reigned there have held the throne unjustly as usurpers. And then, of course, his real point was, in the kingdom of England, a certain Henry subjected Richard II, the king of England, and his own king to a powerful death. And from this time forward, Henry's successors have held the throne of the king unjustly as usurpers. And that's history on a roll. Thank you.
Thank you both for those papers. I'm sure there are going to be lots of questions, and I see one over here. Oh, sorry. Speakers, please come up to the table. And is there a microphone? Yeah, there it is. First,
Second.
Thank you very much for both of your papers. Informational question about the rolls. It seemed that the long roll you dealt with was double-sided. Could you speak about that and how that works?
Yes. Okay. So I mentioned Peter of Poitiers, who was kind of an exemplary roll maker at the end of the 12th century. The long roll that I showed, which is very long, it's 37 feet and it's 13 membranes, was designed to be an English genealogical roll, but someone took advantage of there being a back to a roll which is actually a very awkward proposition when studying a role, that there's something on the back of it. It kind of messes it up, actually. It's technology. But on the back of the role is Peter of Poitiers. So that role is doing sort of double duty as a genealogy of English kings and a genealogy of the life of Christ. And you can see how, like, you know, that role could do double duty that way. And in a certain way that the Peter of Poitiers genealogy on one side is also like very directly authenticating the genealogy of English kings on the other side.
I have two remarks, one to each of you. My family has a genealogical role, and it's wide and short, not narrow and long. In fact, if you think of it, how to represent a family, how to include just your cousins, no one else, then it will be wide and short, which reinforces your argument that these are not very practical. So they express many other things except for representing the real structure of a family. Even this one that you gave us is rather like wide, right, and short. So if you really want to represent how generations followed each other, then it will not be narrow and long. And as for the cities, you mentioned that the guy who prepared the map of Munich out of wood was commissioned not to sell it to anyone else. I'm wondering, is it the reason might be that some of these famous city images, including the Nuremberg image that you showed us, was recycled in early modern printed editions in order to represent completely different cities, which looked different. Was it not the reason for that?
Well, this is actually a relief map. So it's a kind of quite a specific type of object. It's not flat. And it seems to have coincided with the installation of the new kind of reinforcement. I mean, there was a city wall already, but reinforcement, refortification. So the thinking is that this was made to kind of, for the council to strategically understand the city and best view from above. But I mean, of course, it's three-dimensional, it's tactile as well. And it's interesting that this remark, this kind of condition exists there, that he's not to go away and make more models of Nuremberg, which then he could sell to, you know, rivals and potentially enemies. So I think that was but what the point I was trying to make is that when you look at it, it seems to be more than just saying, well, the fortifications are here, the castle is there, the river is side. You know, there's quite a lot of loving detail there that seems to be a sort of source of pride and matches how we understand Nuremberg was seen by its own inhabitants at the time.
Yeah, I have a question for it's mostly for Emily, but I guess also for Zoe as well. So these roles, you describe very nicely how, in a sense, these roles, how you envision these roles could encode certain views of looking at history. What evidence do we have of the actual use? For example, how often in a year would these things be viewed? Is there any way to know that? Because it really, when you look at them and you see them in the exhibit, you kind of get the feeling that most of the time they would just spend their time just rolled up and they would just be there, and people would know that this proves who's the legitimate king or proves how wonderful Rostock is, but you never actually open it and look at it. Do we have any evidence on how often?
I mean, and that's a question I've thought about a lot. And I think one of the problems is that roles are pretty precarious. Like, on one hand, yes, they can be sort of usefully stored, as you point out. But when taken out, they can be really precarious, especially if people unsew them and like put them on a wall or arrange them on a table, which means that I think that although hundreds of roles survive, I would even think 1,000 roles survive. The ones that survive, I think, are the ones that were less looked at. So because I think having rolled and unrolled roles so many times, I feel like, you know, you would cause so much damage to those roles if you took them out a lot. So that's not to say that all roles were sort of symbolic of political claims. I think there's lots of evidence that they were used and added to, and that people were interested in them for like their deep history as well as their claims about the present, based on things that are added to the rolls, comments that are in the rolls. But I think that it's hard to gauge how often they were used in general, just because of the ones that survive or the ones that are less used. I'll just say one other thing about that, and which I thought about when listening to your presentation, is it's hard to figure out how people like literally used a roll. Like it would have to be a really narrow table for people to be able to actually read them. Like when they're put down on a wide table, it's actually very hard to be able to turn around and look at them. I just find that very peculiar.
I mean, mine is slightly different in the sense that there are lots of genealogical roles, but there isn't another that I know of representation of a city view as a scroll. I mean, that is very odd, and it makes it even stranger. You know, how do you view a city if you have to unwind 20 meters of a scroll? So my idea that you walk around, but we still don't know how this was displayed. It seems to be in private hands until the archive bought it in the 19th century. So my thought that this was a present to the council and that it would have been put out or in the church. There's no evidence for this. It was privately owned by the same family of the guy who produced it. So that makes even, you know, there are city views that are meter long. You know, it's a big picture, but still a picture you can hang. I gave a paper on this, a slightly different angle of it, at Harlexton in Cambridge in August. There were also historians there, and we discussed this, and one of the suggestions was comparing it to some processional rolls from the Low Countries that appear at this time. And there was some mentioning of kind of unscrolling around the room and people, you know, hanging them over a fireplace, and you would look at it. But this is also about, you know, quite this wide as well. So this, as you say, the mechanics of it are very complex, and I still can't resolve them. So my scroll is not a scroll anymore. So it's now 7 pieces, which apparently technically can be put together because it's paper rather than skin. It's even more fragile. So
Do you have time for one?
I'll project my voice.
there's another.
Thank you. My question follows from the previous one in terms of audience and use for these roles. I have in mind the chronology machine that is a Princeton University library, which is a universal history from Adam and Eve to the present, which was mid-18th century. And so it's a roll, but it is inserted in a mechanism with a crank, with a handle that you turn, and so you see time actually passing. You can control time. But the idea there is that you never get to see the whole thing at the same time, whereas both presentations seem to indicate that you think that the purpose of the role was to be seen at once. And so I'm wondering, on the one hand, if there is no documentation at all about use of these roles, how they were read, seen, exhibited, if it was once in a lifetime that you opened the scroll for some special purpose because it was such a big deal to open the roll. And if there are no documents, then whether this chronology machine, the fact that it obliges you to focus on a certain amount of time at a time, invites some speculation. If this is an innovation, a radically new way of using the roles in the mid-18th century, or if it is the culmination of a way of interacting with these technologies that gets automatized to an extent.
I mean, my answer is short because, you know, mine is a city view. My idea is that you have to literally, I mean, it kind of makes you walk through the city. through some kind of made-up route. I mean, it doesn't work as a continuous view of any city, so it's a kind of putting several things together. I know what you're talking about, though, because there was an exhibition in London at Lambeth Library of these time almanacs, and there was quite a number of them. They can be quite small and large. They unfold. They're usually grids. This is pre-mechanized thing. They're also used as predictors of things. You know, if the rain falls on the first Thursday of May, you know, all your crops will fail, or, you know, you'll have a son born and so on. So these things exist as well, but they are kind of quite practical. You can fold them, you can put them in your pocket, you can use them as an everyday thing. I think mine is a spatial thing. I think what Emily's working on is slightly different. It has different purpose, so.
I don't know that example, but it's a great example. And I would just say that written technologies have ideals, and then they have like their actual practical instantiations. And I think that the roll in particular, or the scroll, in those cases, as opposed to a codex, I think that the ideal form and the ideal use of the roll is at least as important as the actual practical individual instantiation, which most of the time is compromised, flawed, fail. Like you saw the genealogical rolls that are copied into codexes, right? Like it's like it's such a compromised solution that, like, you know, it's both hard to use and it doesn't do any of the idealistic function of the roll. But I would say that's true with almost every instantiation of written technology, that there's this ideal way in which it could be used, in which it could deliver certain truths. And then there is the deeply flawed, like, practical instantiation of that form. And I think the one that you're talking about is kind of almost riffing on that, that you can never really get it right. You could in the actual practical act of use.
Great, I'm sorry, I think I have to end the conversation. I'm getting looks from the organizers. Thank you very much.